In the forgotten village of Blackthorn, where the ancient forest pressed close against crooked houses and mist never quite lifted from the cobblestone streets, the people lived by a simple rule. When the blood moon rose, you locked your doors, shuttered your windows, and prayed to whatever gods might listen that Queen Aurelia would pass you by. The Vampire Queen had ruled the night for longer than anyone could remember, emerging from her castle in the mountains when hunger called, leaving behind only drained bodies and whispered warnings to future generations. Mothers frightened children into obedience with tales of her crimson eyes and razor smile. Fathers spoke her name like a curse. But young Dmitri, the blacksmith's son with soot always under his fingernails and questions always on his lips, felt something different when he heard those stories. Something that wasn't fear at all. He was only 5 years old the first time he saw her. The blood moon hung fat and red over Blackthorn, and despite his father Ivan's stern commands, Dmitri had crept from his bed and pressed his face against the window glass. The street below lay empty and silver with moonlight, every door barred, every shutter closed. Then she appeared, moving like smoke given form, her gown the color of midnight and dried roses. Queen Aurelia stopped directly below his window, and though it should have been impossible, though he was just a child on the second floor of a darkened house, she looked up and met his eyes. For a moment that stretched like taffy in his memory, they simply stared at each other. The Vampire Queen, ancient and terrible, and the blacksmith's son who didn't know enough to be afraid. Then she smiled. Not the predatory grin from the stories, but something sadder, more curious, and continued down the street. Dmitri's heart hammered not with terror but with fascination. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Over the following weeks, while his father worked the forge and the village returned to its nervous normalcy, Dmitri became obsessed. He pestered old Katya, the herb woman who remembered more years than she'd admit to, asking questions about the queen. Where did she come from? How long had she lived? What did she want? Katya would wave him away with gnarled hands, muttering about foolish boys and dangerous curiosities. But sometimes late at night when the fire burned low, she'd share fragments of the true history. Queen Aurelia had not always been a monster, she said. Centuries ago, before Blackthorn existed, before the great kingdoms rose and fell, there had been a woman who'd been betrayed by those she loved and offered a choice: die human or live forever. She'd chosen eternity and spent the endless years since ruling the darkness, neither fully monster nor fully the woman she'd been. The loneliness, Katya said, was the real curse. Immortality meant watching everyone you could ever care about crumble to dust. Young Dmitri absorbed these stories like dry earth soaking up rain. In the secrecy of the forge, when his father slept, he began working on something special. His small hands weren't yet strong enough for the heavy work of horseshoes and plowshares, but he could manage delicate things. He heated iron scraps in the coals, hammered them on the anvil with careful taps, bent and shaped them with pliers until blisters rose on his palms. It took him 3 months to complete. A rose forged from iron, crude and imperfect, its petals sharp-edged and its stem wrapped in wire, but unmistakably a flower. A gift for someone who would never die, made from metal that would never decay. The next blood moon, Dmitri slipped out while Ivan snored in his chair, the iron rose clutched in both hands. The village street stretched empty and threatening, but he walked with purpose toward the town square where a centuries-old well stood dry and abandoned. The stories said Queen Aurelia always passed this spot. He waited, shivering in his thin nightshirt, until the temperature dropped and the shadows deepened, and she materialized before him like a nightmare taking shape. This close, she was even more magnificent and terrible than he remembered. Her skin held the pale luminescence of moonlight on snow. Her eyes burned like garnets catching firelight. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ages. Little blacksmith's son. Does your father know you've come to meet death? Dmitri held out the iron rose with trembling hands. I made this for you, Queen Aurelia, because you're alone and everyone is afraid of you, and I thought, maybe you'd like something that won't die. His child's voice cracked with earnestness. When I grow up, I'm going to be strong and brave, and I'm going to marry you so you won't be lonely anymore. The Vampire Queen stared at the offering, and for the first time in 300 years, she felt something crack in the ice around her heart. She took the rose with fingers that could crush stone, held it as gently as spider silk, and studied the boy's face. Such strange innocence, such impossible devotion from one who should run screaming. She should laugh. She should frighten him properly and send him home to safety. Instead, she tucked the iron rose into her bodice, where it rested cold against her unbeating heart. "Very well, little Dmitri. I accept your promise. But you should know that choosing me means choosing darkness. It means walking a path from which there is no return." She traced one sharp nail along his cheek, not quite breaking skin. "Grow strong, grow brave, and we shall see if your heart remains as fearless as it is tonight." Then she vanished, and Dmitri stood alone in the square with the mark of her touch still tingling on his face, knowing with absolute certainty that his life had just changed forever. He returned home, climbed back into bed, and dreamed of crimson eyes and promises that would shape his destiny. 15 years passed like pages turning in a book written in smoke and steel. Ivan died when Dmitri was 16, a piece of hot metal piercing his heart in a forge accident that the young man would carry guilt over for the rest of his days. The blacksmith's son became the blacksmith, taking over the forge and the small house, building a reputation for work that bordered on artistry. His horseshoes never threw, his blades never dulled. People whispered that he had a gift, perhaps even a touch of magic, though Dmitri knew the truth was simpler. He poured everything he had into the work, because it was the only thing that quieted the restlessness in his soul. At night, when the forge fires died and the village slept, he'd stand outside and look toward the mountains where Queen Aurelia's castle loomed like a dark crown against the stars. He never forgot his promise, never stopped preparing himself for a destiny he didn't fully understand but couldn't abandon. Queen Aurelia appeared only rarely during those years, her hunts taking her to other villages, other territories. But she kept the iron rose. In the depths of her castle, surrounded by treasures stolen from kingdoms that no longer existed, she placed Dmitri's crude gift in a place of honor. She would take it out sometimes and study the bent petals, remembering the fearless child who'd promised her forever. Part of her hoped he'd forgotten, grown into a normal life with a human wife and human children. Part of her, the part she tried to bury beneath centuries of practiced coldness, counted the years until he'd be strong enough to fulfill his vow. She told herself she was curious, nothing more. But the iron rose never tarnished, and neither did her memory of dark eyes looking at her with wonder instead of terror. Everything changed the summer Dmitri turned 20. Word reached Blackthorn that a dragon had awakened in the scorched peaks, a great serpent called Malachar who'd slumbered for 1,000 years and now terrorized the realm. Villages burned, livestock vanished. The king offered a fortune in gold, and the hand of his daughter to whoever could slay the beast. But no champion who ventured into those mountains returned. Old Katya came to Dmitri's forge one evening, her face grave, and told him what the cards had revealed. His fate and the dragon's were intertwined. If he wanted to reach his queen, if he wanted to be worthy of the promise he'd made, he would have to face Malachar, not for gold or glory, but because the dragon's blood held old magic, the kind that could transform a mortal man into something capable of standing beside an immortal queen. Dmitri spent 3 months forging the weapon he would need. He called it Vow's Edge, a long sword created from an alloy he developed through years of experimentation. Steel formed the core for strength, silver threaded through for magic. He quenched the blade in water blessed by the village priest, and oil pressed from garlic grown in consecrated earth. The sword hummed with potential, its edge sharp enough to split falling silk. When finished, Vow's Edge was more than a weapon. It was a promise made tangible.
He left Blackthorn on a morning thick with fog, carrying the sword, a pack with provisions, and the protective charms Katya had pressed into his hands with whispered warnings about keeping his humanity. The journey into the scorched peaks took 12 days of hard climbing, through territories where the trees grew twisted and black, where bones littered the path, where the air itself tasted of ash and sulfur. Dmitri camped beneath overhangs and moved during daylight, seeing evidence of Malachar everywhere. Massive claw marks gouged in stone, scales the size of dinner plates scattered like deadly confetti, the charred remains of those who'd come before. Fear lived in his throat, but so did determination. He'd made a promise to a vampire queen when he was 5 years old. He would keep it or die trying. Malachar's lair was a cave system in the mountain's heart, its entrance a throat of darkness that breathed heat. Dmitri entered with Vow's Edge drawn and his heart hammering against his ribs. The tunnels opened into a vast cavern where gold and jewels lay heaped like garbage, and there, coiled atop his hoard with wings folded and smoke curling from his nostrils, was the dragon. He was massive beyond imagining, scales black as midnight and red as fresh blood, eyes like molten gold fixing on the tiny human who dared disturb his rest. When Malachar spoke, the words rumbled through stone and bone. "Another fool come to die for glory. Your sword is pretty, little blacksmith, but it will not save you." The battle that followed would be burned into Dmitri's memory forever, assuming he survived to have memories. Malachar moved with impossible speed for something so large, his tail smashing stalactites, his claws gouging trenches in the cavern floor. Fire erupted in gouts that turned the air into shimmering waves of heat. Dmitri rolled, dodged, used the terrain and his smaller size to his advantage, looking for openings that seemed impossible to find. The dragon's scales turned aside strike after strike, Vow's edge scraping but not penetrating, and Dmitri felt despair creeping in. He wasn't strong enough, wasn't fast enough. This would be where his story ended, roasted alive in a dragon's lair, his promise to Queen Aurelia dying with him. Then Malachar made his mistake. Lunging forward with jaws wide to snap Dmitri in half, the dragon exposed his throat, and in that fraction of a second the blacksmith saw his chance. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, just moved, throwing himself forward and driving Vow's edge upward with every ounce of strength he possessed. The blessed silver alloy punched through the soft scales beneath the dragon's jaw and sank deep, finding something vital. Malachar's roar became a gurgle. His massive body convulsed, thrashing in death throes that brought half the cavern down. Dmitri barely made it out, stumbling through collapsing tunnels as dragon blood, black and smoking, poured over him. It burned like acid and ice simultaneously, soaking through his clothes, seeping into cuts and abrasions, forcing its way into his mouth and nose and eyes. He screamed, feeling something fundamental shift inside him, his cells rewriting themselves, his very essence changing. He collapsed outside the cave as the mountain groaned and sealed itself. When consciousness returned hours later, Dmitri knew immediately that nothing would ever be the same. His senses had sharpened to an almost painful degree. He could hear a rabbit's heartbeat 100 yards away, could smell rain coming 3 days hence. His skin felt strange, too tight, and when he looked at his hands, black veins ran beneath the surface like cracks in porcelain. The dragon's blood had cursed him, infected him with something ancient and hungry. Already he could feel it whispering at the edges of his mind, a shadow self that wanted to burn and destroy and feast, but mixed with the curse came power. Strength beyond human limits, healing that closed wounds in minutes instead of weeks. And something else, something that made him aware of magic in a way he'd never been before. He was no longer fully human, but neither was he a monster. He was something between, something new, and if he didn't find help soon, the curse would tip him into darkness entirely. There was only one place to go, one person who might understand what he'd become. Dmitri gathered Vow's edge, left Malachar's hoard untouched despite the fortune it represented, and began the long journey to Queen Aurelia's castle. It took him 8 days of hard travel, and each night the hunger grew stronger. He wanted to hunt, to chase, to feel something's life drain away beneath his hands. The charms Katia had given him burned against his skin, holding back the worst of the curse, but they wouldn't last. By the time the castle appeared on the horizon, its black towers clawing at storm clouds, Dmitri was barely holding himself together. The shadow self had grown a voice, constantly whispering seductions about the power he could claim if he just stopped fighting and surrendered to the darkness. The castle gates stood open, which should have been a warning. Dmitri walked through courtyards where stone gargoyles tracked his movement with eyes too intelligent to be mere decoration. The very walls pulsed with old magic, blood magic, centuries of power soaked into mortar and stone. He found her in the throne room, a vast space lit by floating candles that burned with crimson flames. Queen Aurelia sat in a chair carved from a single piece of obsidian, and after 15 years she was exactly as he remembered and nothing like his memories at all. She wore her immortality like others wore fine jewelry, every movement precise and ancient, her beauty the kind that hurt to look at directly. When she saw him, something flickered across her face. Recognition, surprise, and beneath that, carefully hidden, something that might have been joy. "Little Dmitri," she said, rising from her throne with supernatural grace. "You've grown, and you've brought me something interesting." She inhaled deeply, and her eyes flashed brighter. "Dragon's blood, how deliciously foolish. Do you have any idea what you've done to yourself?" He dropped to one knee, more from exhaustion than formality. "I've kept my promise, my queen. I've become strong and brave. And now I'm here to ask you to save me before this curse consumes what's left of my humanity." Aurelia descended from her dais and circled him like a predator evaluating prey. She could smell the dragon magic radiating from him, could sense the war being waged inside his body between human and something far darker. Against her better judgment, against the ice she'd wrapped around her heart for 3 centuries, she reached out and tilted his face upward. "You beautiful, stupid boy. Dragon's blood doesn't just curse you, it transforms you. Makes you nearly immortal, yes, but at the cost of your soul. You'll live for centuries. But you'll be a monster." She paused, studying his eyes, and found them still clear despite everything. Still that same impossible devotion she remembered from a 5-year-old child offering her an iron rose. "Unless someone balances the curse with another kind of magic, unless someone binds you to something powerful enough to anchor your humanity." "That's why I'm here," Dmitri whispered. "I made you a promise, my queen. I intend to keep it." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Aurelia felt uncertain. This was dangerous in ways she hadn't anticipated. If she bound him to her, if she used her own vampire essence to balance the dragon's curse, they would be connected in ways that transcended mere marriage. Their lives would intertwine. Their thoughts might bleed together. She could lose the careful distance she'd maintained for centuries, the emotional coldness that made immortality bearable. But looking at him kneeling before her, this man who'd spent 15 years becoming worthy of a childhood promise, who'd slain a dragon and damned himself just to stand at her side, she found she couldn't refuse. Didn't want to refuse. "Very well, Dmitri, but know this. What I'm offering isn't salvation. It's transformation. You'll never be fully human again. And being bound to me means entering a world of darkness and blood and endless political games that make dragon slaying look simple. The vampire court is dangerous, ancient. They'll see you as a threat or a curiosity or prey, and I cannot always protect you." "I don't need protection," he said, though they both knew it was bravado. "I need you." She smiled then, and it was a complicated expression mixing fondness and sadness and hunger. "Then rise, my little blacksmith. Rise and let me show you what forever truly means." She pulled him to his feet and led him deeper into the castle, through corridors lined with portraits of the dead, through chambers holding treasures and horrors in equal measure, until they reached her private sanctum. There, on a pedestal of silver, sat the iron rose he'd given her 15 years ago. It had never tarnished. Never aged, she picked it up with reverent care. "I've kept your promise safe all these years, now let me keep you." What followed was not the gentle romance Dmitri had imagined as a child. Aurelia fed from him that night, her fangs piercing the vein in his neck, and the connection that flooded between them was overwhelming. He felt her hunger, yes, but also her loneliness, the crushing weight of centuries lived alone, watching kingdoms rise and crumble, watching everyone she'd ever cared about age and die and turn to dust. He felt her fear, carefully hidden beneath layers of cruelty and power, that she would exist forever in isolation. And she felt him in turn, felt his devotion that had never wavered, felt the strength that had driven him to slay a dragon, felt the curse threatening to consume him, and reached in with her own magic to wrestle it into submission. The dragon's darkness and the vampire's eternal night wound together, creating something new, something balanced. When she finally pulled away, her lips stained crimson. They were bonded in ways few mortals and immortals had ever been. "You'll live as long as I do now," she whispered against his skin. "Centuries, millennia perhaps, but you won't be vampire, won't be dragon. You'll be something unique, my consort, my anchor to the humanity I've nearly forgotten." Dmitri's mind reeled with the connection still humming between them. He could feel her presence like a second heartbeat, could sense her emotions as clearly as his own. "What happens now?" "Now," Aurelia said, pulling back and letting her queen's mask slip back into place. "Now you face the real trial, the Crimson Council." The Crimson Council consisted of 7 vampires older than Aurelia herself, ancient creatures who'd granted her dominion over this territory centuries ago, and who served as both advisors and threats to her rule. They appeared 3 nights later, summoned by blood magic to pass judgment on the queen's unprecedented decision to bind herself to a mortal. They manifested in the throne room like shadows gaining substance. Lord Cassius, cold and calculating, who'd been old when Rome fell. Lady Morgana, beautiful and vicious, who'd inspired 1,000 tales of succubi and demons. Brother Thorn and Brother Vale, twins who'd been turned together and shared thoughts across any distance. The scholar, who'd forgotten his original name and now existed only to accumulate knowledge. Mistress Ravenna, whose cruelty was legendary even among vampires. And finally, the patriarch, oldest of them all, whose true age was measured in epochs rather than mere centuries. They studied Dmitri with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, and he felt like an insect beneath their regard. The patriarch spoke, his voice dry as tomb dust. "Queen Aurelia, you have bound yourself to this creature, this mongrel thing that is neither human nor dragon nor vampire. You have upset the balance without consulting the council. Explain yourself." Aurelia stood beside her throne, regal and utterly composed despite the danger. "I have chosen a consort, as is my right as ruling queen of this territory. That he is unique makes him valuable, not problematic. The dragon's blood gives him power. My essence gives him control. Together, we are stronger." "Or," Lady Morgana purred, "you are compromised, made weak by sentiment, made vulnerable by attachment." She glided closer to Dmitri, inhaling deeply. "He smells delicious, I'll grant you that. The dragon magic adds a lovely spice. But what happens when the curse overwhelms him? When he loses control and becomes a threat? Will you be able to destroy what you've claimed to love?" "He won't lose control," Aurelia said, but there was a thread of uncertainty beneath the words. "Prove it," the patriarch commanded. "Subject him to the trial of 7 nights. Let each member of the council feed from him, testing his ability to maintain himself under the most extreme circumstances. If he survives with his sanity intact, we accept him as your consort. If he fails..." The ancient vampire smiled, showing teeth like tombstones. "Well, then the problem solves itself, doesn't it?" The trial of 7 nights was an ancient rite, used historically to test those who would join the vampire courts. Each night, one council member would feed from the subject, taking them to the brink of death, flooding their mind with centuries of memories and madness, testing their ability to maintain identity and sanity under impossible pressure. Most humans died by the 3rd night. Those who survived often went irrevocably insane. But Dmitri was not fully human anymore, and he had the dragon's resilience flowing through his veins alongside Aurelia's stabilizing essence. He met the patriarch's smile with his own. "I accept your trial." The first night, Lord Cassius fed from him in a chamber carved entirely from ice. The ancient vampire's bite brought visions of Rome burning, of civilizations collapsing, of the meaninglessness of human struggle against eternity. Dmitri felt his mind stretching, threatening to snap under the weight of so much history, so much death. But he focused on the one constant, the iron rose, the promise he'd made, the devotion that had carried him through dragon fire and curse. When Cassius pulled away, Dmitri was still himself, barely but enough. The second night, Lady Morgana took him to her chambers where the walls crawled with darkness. Her feeding was seduction and violation intertwined, pleasure and pain until he couldn't distinguish between them. She showed him every person she'd destroyed, every innocent she'd corrupted, trying to awaken the darkness inside him, to let the dragon's curse consume him. But again, he held on. Thought of a 5-year-old boy standing in an empty square with an iron rose. Thought of Aurelia's loneliness that he'd sworn to end. When dawn came, he was still sane. The twins, Brother Thorn and Brother Vale, fed together on the 3rd night, their shared consciousness trying to fracture his identity, to make him forget where he ended and they began. The scholar, on the 4th night, poured 1,000 lifetimes of knowledge into his mind until he couldn't remember his own name. Mistress Ravenna, on the 5th night, fed on his pain itself, drawing out every trauma, every fear, every moment of suffering he'd ever experienced and magnifying it 1,000-fold. By the 6th night, Dmitri was barely holding on. His body was covered in bite scars that healed slowly, his mind a fractured thing held together by sheer stubborn will. The patriarch came for him personally, and the ancient vampire's feeding was the worst yet because it was simple truth. He showed Dmitri what eternity really meant, the endless years stretching forward, everyone he'd ever known from his mortal life aging and dying while he remained unchanged. The crushing burden of existing century after century, watching the world transform into something unrecognizable. The slow erosion of humanity, of compassion, of everything that made life worth living. "This is what you've chosen," the patriarch whispered as he drank. "Is your devotion strong enough to endure this, to remain yourself across the ages?" Dmitri felt something inside him reach its breaking point. The dragon's curse surged, sensing weakness, trying to drown him in its dark hunger. His shadow self rose up, promising relief if he'd just surrender, just let go. For a moment he teetered on the edge of losing everything he was. Then through the haze of pain and madness he felt Aurelia's presence. Their bond, forged through blood and magic, pulsed like a lifeline. She was there, not physically, but in his mind, lending him strength. Reminding him that he wouldn't face eternity alone. That was the difference. That was what would make forever bearable. He grabbed onto that connection and pulled himself back from the abyss. When the patriarch released him, Dmitri collapsed but didn't break. Dawn found him alive, sane, and still himself despite everything. The ancient vampire studied him with something that might have been respect. 6 nights, only one remains. Queen Aurelia, the 7th feeding is yours. Complete his trial. That final night, Aurelia came to him not in ceremony but in the quiet of her chambers, where the iron rose sat on its pedestal. She looked at him, this man who'd endured horrors that would have shattered lesser beings, all because of a promise made by a fearless child. "You can still refuse," she said softly. "Walk away. Return to your forge, your mortal life. I release you from your vow." Dmitri smiled, and despite the exhaustion and pain, it was genuine. "I didn't come this far to turn back now, my queen." He offered his neck. "Finish what we started." Her feeding was different from the others. Where the council had tested him with their cruelty and madness and ancient power, Aurelia shared herself. He felt not just her loneliness but her hope. Not just her darkness but the remnants of light she'd guarded for centuries, waiting for someone who might see her as more than a monster. She drank deeply, taking him to the edge of death and then pulling him back, her own blood mixed with his, their essences intertwining so completely that afterward, neither could say where one ended and the other began. When she finally pulled away, her eyes were bright with tears she hadn't shed in 300 years. "It is done," she whispered. "You've survived the trial of 7 nights. You are mine, and I am yours for as long as eternity lasts." The Crimson Council convened one final time to witness Dmitri's survival. Even the patriarch seemed impressed. "He endures. The mortal blacksmith has become something new. We recognize him as consort to Queen Aurelia and grant him status within the vampire courts. May his devotion prove as enduring as the magic that now sustains him." In the years that followed, Dmitri learned to navigate the treacherous politics of immortal society, to balance the dragon's curse with his vampire bond, to exist in the space between human and monster. He never forgot who he'd been, that boy in the forge with dreams of the impossible, and that memory kept him grounded as decades passed into centuries. Aurelia, for her part, found that immortality became less burden and more gift when shared with someone who chose to walk beside her not from compulsion or fear, but from a promise made with a child's earnest heart. The iron rose sat between them always, a reminder of the beginning, and it glowed now with its own faint magic. A symbol of transformation, of devotion strong enough to defy death itself, of love that bridged the gap between mortal and eternal, proving that even in darkness, even in blood and night and endless time, hope could flourish. They ruled together, the Vampire Queen and her impossible consort, and their story became legend whispered in villages. A tale of how sometimes the bravest thing isn't slaying the dragon, but keeping the promises you make when you're 5 years old and don't know any better than to believe in forever.